Have you ever had one of those Saturdays that feels exactly right? The kind where sunlight slips through the blinds, the kitchen smells like fresh coffee, and the world outside is quiet enough for you to finally hear your own thoughts. My name is Emily Grant, and on the morning my life changed, I believed I was just another ordinary woman in an ordinary apartment in Chicago. I had my rituals, a favorite mug, a playlist of old jazz, a window that looked out over the city's heartbeat. I loved these little moments because they felt safe, like nothing could touch me here, not in this soft cocoon I'd built for myself. Sometimes I think we all carry a version of that safety with us, a belief that if we just follow the rules, keep our heads down, and do the right thing, nothing bad can slip through the cracks. I had just settled into my desk, still tracing the taste of coffee on my tongue, when my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, no name, no hint of who might be calling. Most days I would have let it go to voicemail, but for some reason, maybe just a passing instinct, I picked up. "Hello," I answered, voice still gentle from the morning. On the other end, a calm voice said, "Is this Emily Grant?" There was a short pause, the kind that makes your heart beat a little faster, even when you don't know why. "This is Ryan from River City Bank. We're calling about your mortgage balance of $670,000. For a second, it felt like the world froze. I remember blinking at the sunlight, sure I had misheard. "I don't have a mortgage," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. There was a pause. Then, the voice explained they had my full name, my birthday, even my social security number. The details lined up in ways that left no room for hope. Suddenly, the safety of my Saturday shattered, replaced by a kind of fear I'd only read about in other people's stories. I wish I could say I stayed calm, that I handled everything with grace. The truth is, I sat there clutching my phone, feeling a strange emptiness growing inside me. How could something like this happen to someone who always played it safe? I tried to convince myself there was a simple mistake, that it would sort itself out with a few phone calls. But deep down, another voice whispered, "What if this isn't a mistake at all? What if someone you trust is at the center of this storm?" That thought lingered long after the call ended, echoing through the quiet apartment. I walked to my bedroom, opened my drawers, and searched for answers in a pile of old letters and bank statements, hoping desperately for proof that the world was still safe, that my life was still my own. Sometimes life doesn't fall apart with thunder or fireworks. Sometimes it unravels in the soft light of an ordinary morning, one quiet thread at a time. As I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by papers and memories, I realized this wasn't just about a number on a bank screen. It was about trust, about family, about how the things we give freely, our names, our kindness, our belief that we matter, can sometimes be taken without asking. But I also knew deep down that this moment could become the start of something new. Because when the world you know disappears, you have a chance to rebuild piece by piece into something stronger than before. So if you've ever thought that could never happen to me, let my story be a gentle warning, and I hope a gentle light. We never know how strong we are until we're called to stand up for ourselves. And sometimes the hardest part isn't what happens to us, but what we choose to do next. Come with me and I'll show you how even a heartbroken Saturday morning can become the first step toward a life reclaimed. For the rest of that Saturday, the world seemed to move in slow motion. After the call, I wandered my apartment, replaying the conversation in my mind, searching for some logical explanation. How could a bank have all of my information? How could I possibly owe money on a house I'd never even seen, let alone bought? My mind latched onto every possible reason: clerical error, system glitch, maybe even a data breach at the bank. But as I sifted through old emails and opened up my online accounts, I found nothing missing, no strange charges or warnings, nothing out of place except for this one massive, undeniable question mark. Still, a nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I remembered a conversation with my younger brother Jason from almost 4 years ago. He had been talking about wanting to give Mom and Dad a fresh start, how he dreamed of a house with a backyard big enough for family barbecues. Jason always had big plans, but his finances were always shaky. He joked about credit scores the way some people joke about the weather lightly, almost like they don't matter. I remembered thinking at the time that he'd find his way, that maybe someday he really would surprise us all. I never imagined that surprise would come at my expense. I spent the afternoon digging through drawers and file boxes, old tax forms, insurance papers, stacks of unopened mail. At first, I was searching for reassurance, anything to prove that this was a mix-up. But the more I looked, the more uneasy I became. I found an envelope from River City Bank that I'd tossed aside months earlier, thinking it was junk mail. Holding it now, I wondered if it had been a warning I'd missed. The feeling that something was deeply wrong settled in heavy and cold. It's a strange thing the way betrayal creeps in. Most of us imagine it as something loud, a slammed door, a shouted argument, a dramatic reveal. But for me, it was a series of small, quiet moments. The look on Jason's face when I'd helped him fill out a FAFSA form for college, the time I'd co-signed a car loan for him, after his old beater died, the way my mother always said, "You're the reliable one, Em. We know we can count on you." I thought those moments were acts of love. I didn't realize they were slowly weaving a net I couldn't see until it closed around me. Stories like mine aren't as rare as you might hope. Not long ago, I read about a woman in Ohio whose older brother had opened credit cards in her name for years, paying just enough on each bill to avoid suspicion. By the time she realized what had happened, her credit was destroyed, and she owed thousands. She said the hardest part wasn't the money, or even the hassle of fixing her records. It was the heartbreak of knowing someone she trusted had used her life as collateral for their dreams. I felt that pain echo inside me as I sorted through my own records, realizing that sometimes the people who know us best are the ones best equipped to hurt us. As daylight faded, my search turned up more questions than answers. I started making lists. What paperwork had I ever signed for Jason? When did I last hand over my social security number? Did anyone else in my family have access to my birth date? My old addresses? Each memory stung a little moments that had seemed harmless, even generous now cast in a different, harsher light. I'd always prided myself on being helpful, the one who could be counted on in a pinch. Now I saw how easily that quality could be twisted, how quickly trust could be weaponized. If I could give one small piece of advice to anyone listening, it would be this: kindness and trust are beautiful, but they are not blank checks. Loving your family does not mean surrendering your safety. In America, where we are raised to believe in the power of family bonds, it's easy to ignore those small, uneasy feelings, the ones that tell us to pause, to ask questions, to say no. But every act of trust deserves a little wisdom alongside it. Check your credit once in a while. Lock your important documents. Don't be afraid to set gentle boundaries even with those you love. By nightfall, I was exhausted. The neat world I'd built for myself, full of routines and gentle certainties, felt like it was slipping out from under me. But as I closed the last file and turned off my desk lamp, I also felt something new blooming inside: determination. I wouldn't let this define me. If the truth was hiding in my own history, then I would find it piece by piece, no matter how painful the answers turned out to be. I took a slow breath, knowing that tomorrow I would start asking harder questions about trust, about love, and about what happens when those things are tested. And in that quiet, I realized maybe the path forward begins not with blame, but with the courage to see things as they really are. It's strange how our earliest lessons about love and duty are often learned before we can name them. I used to believe I was lucky to be born the good child, the one who never caused trouble, who tidied her room without being asked, who came home on time, and whose grades lined up in neat little rows. My parents, Linda and Frank, were proud of me in their quiet way. Emily's our steady one, my mom would say at family gatherings, as if my reliability was the soft foundation on which our home stood. My little brother Jason, by contrast, was the wild heart, funny, spontaneous, always coming up short on homework or short on cash. He'd charm his way out of chores, or turn even his mistakes into stories worth laughing about. I admired his lightness even as I grew used to being the anchor that kept him from drifting too far. Looking back, I can see how these patterns formed without anyone ever planning them. The roles we play in families often begin as acts of love, staying quiet when Dad came home tired, comforting Jason after a scraped knee making dinner when Mom had to work late. These small things become habits, then expectations. I was the one everyone trusted to lock the doors at night to make sure the bills got paid on time, to keep track of doctor's appointments and school forms. My reward was praise for being low maintenance, for not rocking the boat. There is a kind of invisible pride in being useful, but there is a loneliness in it too. You learn to give, and slowly you forget how to ask for anything in return. I remember a birthday from years ago when I was 16. Jason had forgotten to get me a card, and Mom was so busy with work, she picked up a cake from the grocery store at the last minute. No one noticed that my wish whispered over the candles was simply to feel seen for a moment, not just as the caretaker, but as myself. I never mentioned it. In families, these little disappointments stack up quietly like unread letters in a drawer. The next week, when Jason needed help filling out financial aid forms for college, I was there with my careful handwriting and my patient smile. That's what big sisters do, I told myself. That's just what families are. Years later, I read an article about parentification, the way some children, especially in times of stress, are expected to take on adult responsibilities far beyond their age. It resonated with me, though I'd never thought of myself as deprived or neglected. In America, we often celebrate the child who steps up, who's mature for their years, who smooths over family troubles. But rarely do we ask what's lost in that bargain. The price of always being dependable is sometimes never learning to depend on anyone else. The cost of always being needed is learning to ignore the ache of your own needs. There was a story I once heard from a friend about her cousin who was always the fixer in her family. She was the one who solved every crisis, managed everyone's schedules, mediated every fight. One year, her brother used her credit to lease a car without asking. When she confronted him, the family's reaction was, "You're so responsible, you can handle it." My friend's cousin spent months untangling the mess. What hurt most, she said, wasn't the financial hassle, but realizing her family saw her as a solution, not a person. When she finally drew boundaries, it was the beginning of a long overdue journey toward self-respect. If I could share one small lesson from all this, it's that being reliable is a beautiful trait, but it's not the same as being invulnerable. Sometimes the strongest people are those who learn to say, "This is too much," or "I need help too." I wish someone had told me sooner that you can be loved for who you are, not just for what you do, and that boundaries aren't walls. They are bridges back to your own heart. As I sat with these memories, a quiet realization came over me. The patterns of the past weren't written in stone. If the story of my life so far had been about sacrifice, perhaps it was time to write a new chapter 1 that asked not only what my family needed from me, but what I needed for myself. With that thought, I turned back to the pile of documents on my table. The next morning, I would take a step I'd never taken before I would call the bank again, not as the good child, but as someone ready to fight for her own life. I woke early the next morning, heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and determination. I made a pot of coffee, but barely touched it, my mind already running ahead to the day's most pressing task. It was time to call the bank and ask for proof, real tangible evidence of the debt that had invaded my life. With trembling hands, I dialed the number, bracing myself for whatever truth might come. The woman on the line was polite and businesslike, unaware that her words would crack open the world I thought I knew. Within minutes, she emailed me a PDF copy of the mortgage agreement, my name, my address, my birth date, even my signature. It was all there, so familiar it made my skin prickle. But when I looked closer, something inside me went cold. I'd always been careful with my signature. There was a way I looped the G in Grant, a slight hesitation before finishing the T. This signature was almost perfect, but not quite. The loops were too smooth, the lines too confident. I could imagine someone who knew me well tracing my name over and over, practicing, until they got it close enough to fool a stranger. For a moment, I doubted myself. Had I signed something and forgotten? Was I really losing my grip on reality? But deep down, I knew the answer. Trust isn't just about what's said. It's about what isn't. The little secrets, the casual "don't worry about it," the times Jason had asked for help with paperwork or forms, and I'd handed over my information without thinking. Those weren't isolated acts, they were brushstrokes in a portrait of slow, quiet betrayal. In families, trust is rarely questioned until it's broken. I remembered reading about a woman named Melissa from St. Louis who discovered her husband had secretly taken out loans in her name. She said the hardest part wasn't the financial mess, but the way it made her question everything, every birthday, every late-night talk, every word of comfort. You think you're building something together, Melissa wrote, but you wake up and realize you're standing alone. Her story echoed in my mind as I stared at my own signature, almost but not quite mine. It's a peculiar pain, realizing someone you love has used what you gave them in trust as a tool for their own survival. I started tracing back every instance when I'd shared personal details, tax returns, loan forms, even the times I'd left my wallet on the kitchen table during a holiday dinner. The patterns emerged with unsettling clarity. There was no single moment of disaster, no warning sign with flashing lights. Just a series of tiny permissions, each one adding up to this. I thought of all the times my mother had called me her rock, how it sounded like a compliment but sometimes felt like a burden. Maybe she thought I was too strong to break. Maybe Jason thought I would always be there to fix his mistakes. But in the end, strength doesn't mean silence, and loyalty doesn't mean erasing your own needs. If there's a lesson here, it's that trust and caution are not enemies. Loving your family is not the same as letting your boundaries be crossed again and again. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you've been hurt to see the fracture lines before they deepen into unfixable cracks. I wish someone had told me sooner that questioning what doesn't feel right isn't disloyalty, it's wisdom. We owe it to ourselves to pause, to look closely, to ask for clarity even when it's uncomfortable. Because sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself and for those around you is simply to demand the truth. Sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by documents and doubts, I felt the ground beneath me shift. I couldn't go back to the way things were, not now that I'd seen the truth staring up from the page. But even in that pain, I sensed the possibility of something new. Maybe if I was brave enough to follow this thread of honesty wherever it led, I could build something stronger on the other side. Maybe I could become more than just the family rock. Maybe I could finally stand up for myself, even if it meant standing alone for a while. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the city skyline, I gathered every document I could find, old forms, emails, even birthday cards with handwriting to compare. I realized the next step wouldn't just be about uncovering the past, it would be about choosing my future. Tomorrow I would reach out for help, real help from someone outside my family. Because if trust could be broken, maybe it could also be rebuilt one honest step at a time. The next morning, the city was wrapped in a soft gray mist, as if the world was offering me a little shelter to gather my courage. I poured myself another cup of coffee, though I hardly tasted it, and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by evidence signatures, forms, emails, fragments of my trust scattered across the wood. I realized I'd reached a crossroads. I could continue searching for answers on my own, or I could reach out for help. It's easy sometimes to believe that asking for help is a sign of weakness. We're taught, especially as good children, to solve our own problems, to protect our loved ones, even at the expense of our own peace. But that morning, as the mist lifted and the city brightened, I remembered something my friend Samantha once told me after a tough breakup. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone stand beside you. Her words lingered in my mind, soft and persistent. With trembling fingers, I called Samantha, and within minutes she was at my door with a warm hug and a steady presence. I explained everything, the mortgage, the signatures, my fear that my own family was involved. She listened, really listened, without offering empty reassurances. Then she reached into her bag and handed me a business card. "This is Ben Harris. He's a lawyer, and he's good with messy personal things like this. Let's at least see what your options are." That afternoon, I found myself in a quiet corner of Ben Harris's office, clutching my folder of documents like a shield. Ben was kind, practical, and asked questions gently but thoroughly. As we sorted through the paperwork, he explained what steps I needed to take: file a police report, notify the bank, officially gather as much evidence as possible, and prepare for difficult conversations. Ben made it clear that this process might not be easy. "The law is on your side," he told me, But family cases can be messy. Be ready for anger, for denial, for people to say you're overreacting. His honesty was both frightening and oddly comforting. For the first time, I felt I wasn't carrying this burden alone. I thought of a news story I'd seen recently, a man in Texas whose brother had taken out credit cards and loans in his name for years. When he finally pressed charges, the backlash from his family was fierce. Some relatives cut him off completely. Others accused him of airing dirty laundry. But he shared later in a radio interview that standing up for himself changed everything. He rebuilt his credit, set healthier boundaries, and most importantly, discovered new sources of support among friends and even strangers. His story reminded me that protecting yourself, even against those you love, isn't an act of betrayal. Sometimes it's the first step toward real healing. Ben helped me write a formal dispute letter to the bank and start the process with the police. He explained how to gather records, what kinds of proof were most persuasive, and what to expect in the days ahead. There was relief in having a plan even as anxiety lingered at the edges. I realized I would need to be patient, persistent, and above all, honest with myself and with everyone else. There is something quietly radical about choosing truth over comfort, about saying no more, even when every part of you aches for things to go back to how they were. If I could share a lesson from those first days of action, it would be this: bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to pick up the phone to ask for help, to write down what happened in black and white. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be erased, even when you're scared. The world is full of people like Ben, like Samantha, like that man in Texas who will show up for you when you show up for yourself. As I left Ben's office that evening, the city lights were flickering on, and I felt something unfamiliar, a cautious hope. There were still hard steps ahead, confronting my family, facing uncomfortable truths, weathering whatever storms might come. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was walking toward the future on my own 2 feet, not just swept along by other people's choices. Tomorrow I would have to see my parents and Jason. I didn't know what I would say or how they would react, but I knew that I would speak honestly and that whatever happened next, I was finally fighting for myself. That evening, I sat on my bed, rehearsing what I would say, but no amount of practice could settle the storm in my chest. The next morning, I walked the familiar path to my parents' house, the small brick home with wind chimes on the porch, and a garden my mother tended with careful hands. Stepping inside felt like crossing into another life. The scents, the photos on the wall, the laughter echoing from the kitchen, these things once meant comfort, but now every detail seemed touched by doubt. Jason was sprawled on the couch, phone in hand, while Mom bustled over the stove and Dad watched the news. They all looked up at my arrival, eyes expectant, casual, unprepared for the truth I carried in my purse. We sat around the table for lunch plates filled with roast chicken and green beans, the conversation as ordinary as any Sunday. But beneath every word, I felt the tension building, a silent plea for honesty pressing against my ribs. When the meal was finished, I set down my fork and spoke as evenly as I could. I need to ask about a mortgage at River City Bank, one taken out in my name. The room fell abruptly silent. Jason's shoulders tightened. Mom's smile faltered, and Dad looked away, suddenly fascinated by a crack in the table. For a few long seconds, no one spoke. Then Mom broke the silence, her voice soft and careful. "Emily, sometimes families have to make tough choices. Your credit is so good, and Jason, well, he just needed a little help getting started." I wanted to cry, to shout, to demand an explanation that made sense. Instead, I listened as they explained how Jason's dream of homeownership was out of reach, how the bank wouldn't look twice at his application alone, how I'd always been the reliable one. They told me it wasn't about hurting me, just about giving us all a future. Their words washed over me, full of justification and old family scripts. But I heard what was missing: no apology, no true acknowledgement of harm. Just the expectation that I would understand that my role as the family safety net was a natural, unquestionable thing. I remembered reading a story about a woman named Carla in California whose parents used her identity to lease a car after their own credit was ruined. When Carla confronted them, her family dismissed her hurt as overreacting, insisting she should be grateful to help. Carla described the experience as being loved for my usefulness, not for myself. Sitting at my parents' table, I felt the sting of her words. Sometimes the worst wounds are those wrapped in affection, masked as duty or tradition. It would be a lie to say I didn't feel guilty. Part of me wanted to sweep it all under the rug, to let Jason keep the house to play my old part a little longer. But another part, tender and determined, knew that real love doesn't ask us to betray ourselves. I spoke my truth quietly, voice steady even as my hand shook. I can't carry this for you. I can't be the solution to every problem anymore. I love you, but what you did is not okay. The words hung heavy in the air. Jason muttered that I was being dramatic. Dad mumbled about family sticking together. But Mom's eyes were shining with something like regret, and for a moment I thought she might say she was sorry. She didn't. If there is a lesson here, it's that boundaries are an act of care both for others and for yourself. You can love your family and still refuse to let them cross certain lines. Real closeness isn't built on silent sacrifice. It's built on honesty and respect. As I left the house, heart aching but strangely lighter, I realized that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's obligation, dressed up as affection. The walk home felt different, less like an exile, more like the first steps on unfamiliar but solid ground. I didn't know how my family would respond in the coming days, or if things would ever return to normal. But I knew I had told the truth, and that for the first time was enough. As dusk settled over the city, I turned my thoughts to the next challenge, how to weather the aftermath and how to start rebuilding my own sense of belonging from the inside out. The days that followed felt heavier than I'd imagined. Even though I'd spoken my truth, the air in my apartment seemed charged with a low, constant anxiety. Every time the phone rang or a message appeared on my screen, my heart jumped. I knew the next steps would be the hardest, moving my struggle from the safety of private heartbreak into the bright, unflinching light of legal action. No matter how gently I approached it, the decision to file a police report against my own family felt like a line I could never uncross. Filing the report was both frightening and oddly formal. I stood in the police station lobby, my folder clutched to my chest, repeating to myself that this was about protecting my life, my credit, and most of all, my future. The officer behind the glass took my statement with practiced calm scanning through the evidence I'd gathered with Ben's help. "You're not alone," he said softly as he stamped the papers. "This happens more often than you'd think." His words were a small comfort, but as I left, I couldn't help but feel a wave of sadness for every family whose trust had been fractured by money, by fear, by desperation. Word spread quickly. My parents called angry and confused. Jason sent a flurry of texts, accusations, pleas, even threats to never forgive me. There was a silence from some relatives and childhood friends, and the absence was almost as loud as the angry words. Some people thought I was right to take a stand. Others whispered that I'd turned on my own. Even at work, colleagues eyed me with a mix of curiosity and caution when I stepped out to answer calls from lawyers and investigators. I was learning painfully how the truth can isolate you before it sets you free. I remembered reading about a man in Michigan, Eric, whose parents used his Social Security number to open a series of store accounts. When Eric finally reported them, he said the hardest part wasn't the paperwork or the damaged credit. It was the holidays that followed the family dinners that felt colder, the cousins who stopped calling. But Eric also said that with time, the people who mattered most understood. They saw that protecting yourself isn't about spite. It's about refusing to be erased no matter who's holding the eraser. The practical side of legal battles was draining. There were interviews, notarized statements, waiting on responses from the bank, the constant anxiety that I'd miss a deadline or make a mistake. Each time I had to retell the story to another official, another advisor, it felt like opening a wound that was just starting to scab over. Sometimes I'd come home and just sit on my floor, too tired even to cry, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic searching for something to anchor me. But if there's a lesson in all of this, it's that self-protection is not selfishness. Too often we're taught that love means absorbing hurt quietly, that speaking out is a kind of betrayal. I learned that setting boundaries and seeking justice, even when it brings discomfort and misunderstanding, is actually an act of deep care for yourself and, in a way, for the family who once leaned on you. No relationship can thrive if built on silence and invisible wounds. Through the slow grind of paperwork and sleepless nights, I began to see something else emerging, a fragile but real sense of self-respect. For the first time, I wasn't hiding my pain or apologizing for my limits. I was defending the life I'd built piece by piece. It was lonely at times, but there was also a small pride in each decision, each boundary, each document signed. As weeks passed and the initial storm quieted, I looked up one morning and realized the world was still turning. The process wasn't over, far from it, but I felt myself breathing a little easier. I thought about what might come next, not just for the case, but for me as a person. What would it look like to start reclaiming my own joy, to rediscover my place in the world, not as the family's caretaker, but as myself? That hope, however faint, was enough to keep moving forward, one gentle step at a time. There's something quietly powerful about reclaiming the hours of your own life. After weeks of legal battles and sleepless nights, I began to notice that the world didn't pause for my pain. Each morning, the sun still found its way through the blinds, the city outside my window buzzed with its usual rhythms, and somewhere in the distance, someone always laughed a reminder that life, no matter how heavy, keeps moving forward. At first, this was a bitter realization. I wanted the universe to acknowledge my struggle to grieve with me. But slowly, I realized that healing wasn't a single leap, it was a series of small, stubborn steps. I started by letting myself do simple things just for me. On Saturdays, I'd visit the farmer's market, picking out flowers for the kitchen table, even when my apartment felt too quiet. I found myself drawn to a pottery class at the community center, my hands shaping imperfect bowls and mugs, each one stamped with a little word or symbol, a private declaration that I was still here, still making something out of the mess. The work wasn't about perfection, but presence. There's a freedom in creating something that exists only because you gave yourself permission to try. I thought of stories I'd read about others who survived family betrayals. One woman wrote about gardening as her anchor planting tulips in the backyard after her mother emptied her savings account without telling her. Another man started running marathons after untangling years of hidden debt, each mile a testament to what he could overcome. These weren't grand gestures, but daily acts of self-reclamation. Their stories reminded me that the way back to yourself isn't always dramatic. It's found in the ordinary things, the patterns of care you extend to your own life. Of course, some days were harder than others. There were mornings I'd wake up angry, wanting to shout into the silence or demand an apology that would never come. There were evenings when the loneliness pressed close, and I questioned whether I'd done the right thing, whether fighting for myself was worth the distance it had put between me and the people I once called home. During those moments, I learned to be gentle with myself, to name the pain without letting it define me. I kept a notebook on my nightstand and filled it with small victories, called the bank, and asked another question, slept through the night without a nightmare, made a stranger smile at the market. Over time, these little notes became proof that healing was happening even when it felt slow. If I could offer a lesson from this chapter, it's this: claiming your own life is not selfish, it's necessary. When you've been the one to carry everyone else, it's easy to forget that your own dreams and boundaries matter just as much. Rebuilding isn't about erasing what happened, but about making space for new beginnings. Sometimes that means starting over with shaky hands, sometimes it means finding support in unexpected places, and sometimes it's as simple as letting yourself rest. We live in a world that tells us to move on quickly, but true healing honors the time it takes. With every small step, I felt my sense of self growing stronger. I reached out to friends who made me laugh, joined a book club, volunteered at the local library on weekends. Slowly, my apartment filled with flowers, half-finished pottery, and books I'd loved since childhood. These weren't just decorations, they were reminders that I could build a life worth living even after loss. I found that the more I claimed my own time, the less power my family's choices held over me. One evening, as spring crept in and the days grew longer, I realized I was looking forward to tomorrow, not out of fear, but with quiet hope. The legal process was still unfolding, and the past hadn't disappeared, but I felt more equipped to handle whatever came next. For the first time in a long while, I believed that joy was possible again, that my story wasn't finished, but simply turning a new page. And as the sun set painting golden lines across my kitchen table, I promised myself to keep moving forward one small, steady victory at a time. Sometimes just when you begin to feel steady again, the past finds its way back to your doorstep. It happened one Sunday afternoon, as the air outside buzzed with the first hints of summer. I was repotting a stubborn little plant on my balcony when I saw them, my parents and Jason, standing at the edge of the parking lot, not quite close enough to knock, not far enough to walk away. For a moment, I simply watched them, wondering what brought them here now after so much silence. Part of me still longed for a gentle ending, a true apology, a sign that we could start over on new terms. But the wiser part of me, softened and strengthened by months of healing, knew better than to wish for something I couldn't control. When I opened the door, I kept my voice calm, heart thumping beneath my ribs. My mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling between hope and pride. "Emily," she said, "we made mistakes, but we're still family. Can't we just find a way back?" Jason shuffled his feet, eyes fixed on the ground. He muttered, "I just need help, Em. Just for a little while." "You always knew what to do." The words landed heavily, echoing old patterns. Dependence, expectation, the assumption that I would step in, patch things up, and absorb the fallout for everyone else. I thought of a story I'd read not long ago about a woman in Oregon whose parents showed up at her workplace after she'd taken legal action to protect her identity. They asked for forgiveness, but when she pressed them for honesty, they turned defensive, framing her boundary as a betrayal. She wrote, "They didn't come because they missed me. They came because they missed what I could do for them." That line stayed with me as I faced my own family. I realized then that sometimes the past doesn't come for reconciliation. It comes for restoration of the old broken order. True healing, I was learning, often means refusing to return to what hurt you, even if it's dressed up as love. I reached for kindness, but not at the cost of clarity. "I hope someday you understand what real family means," I told them gently. "It's not something you can steal or ask for, only when it's convenient. I'm not angry anymore, but I can't be your solution. I have to be my own." I handed my mother an envelope inside a copy of the mortgage document stamped void and the birthday card from years ago, the one that called me the backup plan. She took it, her hands trembling, and for a second I saw something like understanding flicker in her eyes. The moment was full of words left unspoken. My father looked older than I remembered, shoulders slumped, searching my face for a softness I couldn't offer. Jason's frustration was obvious, but so was his confusion. He'd never had to build a life without my safety net. I stood there, grounded in my own hard-won peace, wishing them well, but unwilling to step back into the shadows I'd left behind. The lesson, hard as it was, had become clear. Forgiveness does not require forgetting, and compassion does not demand self-sacrifice. As they turned to go, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The ache of letting go was real, but so was the quiet joy of knowing I could choose my own future. I watched them disappear down the sidewalk, the final thread of obligation loosening with every step. I didn't know if we would ever find our way to a new kind of relationship, one built on respect instead of old debts. But I did know this: I was no longer the backup plan. I was the author of my own story. Back inside, I poured myself a cup of tea and let the quiet fill my home. The past had come knocking, but I'd answered with honesty and left the door open for real change, not just for them, but for myself. Tomorrow I would wake to a world I had claimed as my own, and for the first time I looked forward to it not out of fear, but with a soft, steady hope for whatever came next. The sun rose quietly the next morning, casting gentle golden lines across my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once cried over old bank statements, worried about the future, and wondered if I would ever feel safe in my own life again. Now those memories felt distant, softened by time and healing. Looking back, I saw the winding path I'd taken from the shock of a stranger's phone call to the unraveling of old family patterns, to the hard-won courage of standing up for myself. Every chapter of this journey had taught me something new, not just about boundaries and betrayal, but about the quiet resilience that lives inside all of us waiting to be called forward. I remembered the early days when I believed being the good child meant always saying yes, always picking up the pieces for others, even when it left me empty. Those habits were built from love, but they kept me small and unseen. I thought my value was in what I could give away, not in who I was. Yet through each step, asking for help facing uncomfortable truths, enduring the loneliness of legal battles, and ultimately choosing myself, I learned a lesson that I wish every heart could know: real love honors your boundaries. Compassion starts at home with the way you treat your own spirit. The hardest moments came when I confronted my family not in anger, but in honesty. It was never easy to say, "This hurts," or "I can't carry this for you anymore." There were days when I missed the old warmth of home, but I also knew that peace built on silence was no peace at all. In facing their disappointment, I discovered my own courage, the kind that grows stronger with each small step of healing. My story is just one among many. Across the world, there are people quietly reclaiming their lives sometimes, one hard conversation at a time, sometimes simply by allowing themselves to hope again. If you take anything from my journey, let it be this: you are not selfish for protecting your own heart. You are not wrong for wanting to be seen, to be respected, to build a life that belongs only to you. Whether you've been the caretaker, the fixer, or the forgotten one, your story matters. Every boundary you set is an act of hope, a promise to yourself that you are worthy of kindness, even if it has to start within your own four walls. And now as I look ahead, I feel something I never expected: gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the person I've become because I faced it. My world is quieter now, but it's mine. I have filled it with friends who see me routines that nourish me, and dreams that belong only to me. I have learned that walking away from what hurts you isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning. If you found comfort, hope, or even a little courage in my story, I invite you to join this growing community. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about healing, resilience, and reclaiming your life. Your voice matters, and when we share our stories, we remind each other that no one is truly alone. Let's keep building a world where honesty is honored, boundaries are respected, and every new chapter begins with hope.